May 10th, 1945. 700 miles off the coast of New England, the cold Atlantic waters churned beneath a gray sky as 44 young German sailors stood on the deck of submarine U-858, waiting to discover if they would live or die. These men, who had spent months in the suffocating darkness of their steel coffin, hunting American ships, were about to witness something that would shatter every belief their Nazi commanders had drilled into them about America. What they saw in the coming hours and days would leave them speechless, confused, and questioning everything they thought they knew about their enemy. This is the true story of how surrendering to America became the greatest shock of their lives. The crew of U-858 had received the radio transmission just hours earlier. Admiral Karl Dönitz, now leading what remained of Germany after Hitler's suicide, had broadcast the order every submariner dreaded hearing: lay down your arms. The war is over. For Captain Thilo Bode and his crew, who were halfway across the Atlantic on a mission to terrorize the American coastline, this message meant they were stranded 4,000 miles from home, floating in enemy waters with nowhere to run. They could try to reach a neutral port in South America, risking fuel shortages and mechanical failures. They could attempt the dangerous journey back to a defeated Germany, crossing an ocean now controlled by Allied forces who might not have received the surrender orders. Or they could do something that terrified them more than combat itself. They could surrender to the Americans. Bode made his decision. He ordered his submarine to surface completely, exposing his vessel to attack. He had his crew stand in formation on the narrow deck, unarmed and vulnerable. Then he sent out a distress signal, broadcasting his position to any American warship within range. It was a moment of pure terror. These German sailors had been told horrific stories about what Americans would do to captured U-boat crews. Their propaganda officers had filled their heads with tales of torture, execution, and brutal imprisonment. They expected the approaching American destroyers to open fire, to sink them without mercy, to leave no survivors. The gray shapes of USS Pillsbury and USS Pope appeared on the horizon. The German sailors stood rigid, some trembling, as the American warships circled their submarine like sharks around wounded prey. But then something unexpected happened. The American ships did not fire. Instead, armed Marines approached in small boats, weapons ready but not aimed to kill. The Germans were ordered to raise their hands and prepare for boarding. As U.S. Marines climbed onto the submarine, the German crew braced for violence, for the brutal treatment they had been promised would come. Instead, the Marines were professional, almost businesslike. They searched the Germans for weapons, checked their identification, but there were no beatings, no executions, no throwing prisoners overboard. One German sailor later recalled the moment when a colored porter offered him coffee and a sandwich during the transfer to an American vessel. He said he had always been transported in boxcars during military service, but now he was sitting in a modern upholstered coach, being offered refreshments as though he were human. Most of the crew forgot their anti-American feelings in that instant. The submarine was taken under American control and began the journey to Cape Henlopen, Delaware. U-858 moved slowly through the waters off Cape May, New Jersey, escorted by American warships with the Stars and Stripes, now flying from her conning tower where the Nazi swastika had flown just hours before. For the German sailors transferred to American ships, the journey became increasingly surreal. They had lived for months in what American sailors would later describe as a sewer pipe with valves. U-858 had no shower facilities, no laundry, barely any ventilation. When it got cold, water condensed on every surface, creating a constant rainstorm inside the submarine. The crew slept in bunks that were always damp, ate food that was always stale, and lived in air that was always thick with the smell of diesel fuel. unwashed bodies and human waste. The psychological strain of submarine warfare was immense, always knowing that at any moment, a depth charge could rupture their hull and send them to a crushing death in the dark ocean depths. Now, on American vessels, they discovered something that seemed impossible. The American sailors had clean uniforms, regular hot meals, and space to move around. There were actual sleeping quarters with dry beds. There was coffee available throughout the day, real coffee, not the chicory substitute they had been drinking. When U-858 finally reached Delaware on May 14th, 1945, thousands of Americans gathered to watch the surrender. The German crew, exhausted and filthy after their long patrol, was led off the submarine under armed guard. They walked down the gangplank expecting angry mobs, expecting violence from American civilians whose ships they had been sent to destroy. Instead, they saw curiosity, even some sympathy in the faces watching them. Children pointed and stared. But there was no throwing of stones, no spitting, no physical attacks. The Germans were loaded onto trucks and driven to Fort Miles for processing. During this journey, they saw something that began to crack the foundation of everything they believed. They saw America. These young men had been told that their U-boats were winning the war, that America was on the verge of collapse, that the Luftwaffe had surely devastated American cities just as they had devastated European ones. Instead, they saw intact buildings, bustling towns, civilians going about their daily lives without fear. They saw cars everywhere, private automobiles driven by ordinary citizens, something almost unimaginable in wartime Germany, where fuel was desperately scarce. They saw shops with goods in the windows, people who looked well-fed and well-dressed. A country that showed absolutely no signs of being at war, let alone losing one. At Fort Miles, the processing began. The German sailors were lined up for medical examinations, something they had expected to be brutal. Instead, American doctors treated them professionally, checking for diseases and injuries without cruelty. Those who were sick or wounded received actual medical care. One sailor had a chronic infection that had gone untreated for weeks on the submarine. An American medic cleaned and bandaged the wound, gave him antibiotics, and told him through a translator that he would be fine. The confused German sailor asked why they were helping him. The American medic just shrugged and said it was the right thing to do. After medical checks came the interrogations. The Germans had been trained to resist torture, to give only name, rank and serial number no matter what was done to them. They prepared themselves for the worst. Instead, they sat in rooms with intelligence officers who asked questions calmly, almost conversationally, offering cigarettes and coffee during the sessions. Some Germans, expecting torture that never came, actually found themselves volunteering information, relieved that the interrogation consisted of questions rather than pain. The Americans wanted to know about submarine technology, about patrol routes, about the latest German innovations. But the interrogations were generally conducted without violence, without the torture chambers the Germans had been warned about. There were exceptions, particularly early in the war when fears of submarine launched. Attacks on American cities ran high, but for the vast majority of captured U-boat crews, American interrogation was surprisingly civilized. After processing, the crew of U-858, along with other captured German naval personnel, were sent to prisoner of war camps. The Germans braced themselves for the horror stories they had heard about. American prison camps. Instead, they found themselves in places like Camp Papago Park in Arizona, a facility that German prisoners nicknamed Schlaraffenland, the land of milk and honey. The camp was located in sunny Arizona, a dramatic change from the gray skies and cold waters they were used to. The climate was warm and dry. The barracks, while basic, were clean and weatherproof. Each prisoner had his own bunk with clean blankets. There were shower facilities with hot water. There was a camp theater showing 2 films a week. There was a prisoner-run newspaper. there was a choir. The men did not have to work unless they chose to, though many did, because they were paid American military wages for their labor. 80 cents a day, which they could spend in the camp canteen on snacks, writing materials, playing cards, and other items. The food was the greatest shock of all. After years of wartime rations in Germany, after months of stale bread and canned sardines on submarine patrol, these prisoners found themselves eating 3 meals a day of hot food. There was meat, real meat, served regularly. There were fresh vegetables. There was bread that was soft and fresh, not the hard, dark bread they were used to. There was butter, sugar, coffee. One German POW wrote home that he was eating better in an American prison camp than he had eaten in Germany before. The war even started. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners of war be treated comparably to a nation's own military personnel. America took this obligation seriously, partly out of genuine humanitarian concern, but also strategically. Colonel A.M. Tollefson, Assistant Director of the POW Division, explained it plainly. America intended to play by the rules to avoid giving even the semblance of an excuse to the enemy to violate the rights of American soldiers held as prisoners. This was not just about being nice. This was about protecting American POWs in German camps by ensuring Germany had no excuse to mistreat them. Beyond humanitarian and strategic reasons, there was a practical element. The 425,000 Axis prisoners in American camps, including 378,000 Germans, represented a huge manpower windfall for a nation struggling with labor shortages as millions of American men served overseas. German POWs worked in canneries, mills, farms, and other locations deemed minimal security risks. They picked oranges in California, harvested wheat in Kansas, worked in lumber mills in the Pacific Northwest. They were paid for their labor and generally treated as workers rather than slaves. Some worked alongside American civilians and found themselves befriending their former enemies over shared tasks and lunch breaks. The contrast with how POWs were treated in Germany was stark. American POWs in German camps, particularly in the later years of the war, faced starvation rations, brutal forced marches, and constant fear of execution. Soviet POWs in German camps died by the millions from starvation, exposure, and deliberate murder. The lucky ones were those who were captured by Germans rather than vice versa, because survival rates were dramatically different depending on who held you prisoner. For the German U-boat crews, this humane treatment created a profound psychological crisis. These were young men, many still teenagers, who had been raised under Nazi ideology. They had been taught that Germans were the master race, superior to all others. They had been told that Americans were weak, decadent, mongrel people who would collapse under pressure. They had been assured that Germany was fighting for civilization against barbarism. Now they sat in Arizona, eating 3 square meals a day, watching Hollywood movies, playing volleyball, while letters from home described the devastation of German cities, the starvation of German civilians, the complete collapse of everything they had fought for. They could not reconcile what they had been told with what they were experiencing. Some prisoners maintained their Nazi beliefs despite everything, refusing to accept that they had been lied to. These hardliners made life difficult for other prisoners, particularly for those Germans who began to question the Nazi regime. In several camps, zealous Nazis murdered fellow prisoners they suspected of collaboration or of being insufficiently loyal to Hitler. 14 of these murderers were eventually hanged at Fort Leavenworth after the war. But many German POWs, particularly the younger ones, found their worldview crumbling. They had been told America was their enemy, but America was treating them better than their own government ever had. They had been told Americans were inferior, but American productivity, technology, and wealth were obviously superior to what they had known in Germany. They had been told that Germany was winning, But the evidence all around them showed that America had barely been touched by the war while Germany lay in ruins. U-858 itself became a symbol of this reversal. After surrender, the submarine was docked at Cape Henlopen, where thousands of American civilians came to see it. School children toured the vessel, marveling at the cramped conditions. American sailors were assigned to crew the submarine, and they reported back that living conditions aboard German U-boats were incredibly harsh. The submarine had no regard for creature comfort, they reported. When the vessel hit cold water, it was like a rainstorm inside the boat. American sailors had to put oilcloth over their bunks to keep them from getting soaked. The submarine remained docked for months before being towed to Philadelphia, studied for intelligence purposes, and eventually used as torpedo practice in 1947. By then, the war was long over, and the men who had served aboard her were scattered across America and Germany, forever changed by their experience. Some German POWs liked America so much that they stayed after the war. Despite being former enemies, despite having fought to destroy America, thousands of German prisoners applied for permission to immigrate to the United States once they were released. They had seen the abundance, the freedom, the opportunity that America offered, and they wanted to be part of it. Many married American women they met while working on farms or in factories. Many settled in the communities where they had been imprisoned, becoming citizens of the country they had once tried to destroy. For the crew of U-858 specifically, their experience in American captivity was probably the safest period of their entire war. The submarine had never fired a torpedo in combat, had never been attacked by Allied forces during its patrols. The crew had survived the war without losing a single man to enemy action. They had surrendered without a fight and been treated with unexpected decency. When they finally returned to Germany in 1946, they found a devastated country, cities in ruins, millions dead, an entire nation occupied and divided among the victors. Many of these returning POWs spoke quietly among themselves about their time in America. Some felt guilt that they had lived in relative comfort while their families starved. Some felt anger that they had been lied to so completely about the nature of their enemy. Some felt a strange nostalgia for their time in American prison camps, where they had been warm, well-fed and safe from bombing. The ones who had worked on American farms remembered the abundance they had seen, the casual wealth that even poor American farmers possessed, the sheer scale of a continent that seemed to produce endless food and resources. They remembered American workers who had automobiles, who ate meat regularly, who complained about rationing that would have seemed like luxury to any German civilian. They remembered a country that had fought a global war on multiple continents and yet showed no signs of strain or suffering on the home front. One German POW later wrote that he had learned more about democracy by living in American prison camps than he had learned in years of Nazi political education. He watched American guards treat prisoners with a kind of casual egalitarianism that would have been unthinkable in Germany. He saw American officers who were competent without being brutal, who could maintain discipline without resorting to terror. He experienced a system that had rules and followed them, even when dealing with enemies. For U-boat crews specifically, who had lived through the claustrophobic hell of submarine warfare, who had experienced the constant terror of depth, charges, and the knowledge that their steel tomb could become their grave at any moment. The American POW camps must have seemed like paradise. They had survived the deadliest service in the German military. U-boat crews had the highest casualty rate of any branch of the Wehrmacht, with 75% of U-boatmen dying during the war. To survive that war and then live in comfortable captivity was an outcome beyond their wildest hopes. The story of U-858 and its crew is just one example of a broader historical reality that challenges simple narratives about World War II, yes, America and Germany were enemies. Yes, the Nazi regime was evil and had to be defeated. But the individual soldiers and sailors on both sides were often just young men following orders, caught up in events beyond their control. The humane treatment of German POWs by America was not about being soft on Nazis. It was about maintaining moral standards even in wartime, about following international law even when your enemy did not, and about recognizing the humanity of individuals even when their government was monstrous. The shocked reactions of German POWs to American abundance, American fairness, and American power helped undermine Nazi ideology more effectively than any propaganda could have done. These men returned to Germany after the war and told their stories. They described the America they had seen, and those descriptions helped shape post-war Germany's understanding that the Nazi path had been wrong. Today, U-858 is gone, sunk as target practice decades ago. The men who served aboard her are gone too, passed away in the decades since the war. But their story remains, a reminder of a strange chapter in history when enemies became prisoners. Prisoners became reluctant admirers, and young men who had tried to destroy. America ended up marveling at what they saw when they finally reached American shores. The surrender of German U-boat crews in American waters during 1945 marked the end of the Battle of the Atlantic, a campaign that had killed thousands and threatened to starve Britain into submission. But for the individual sailors involved, it marked something else entirely. It marked the moment when the lies they had been told were exposed, when the enemy they had been taught to hate treated them with unexpected decency, and when they saw firsthand the vast gulf between the reality of America and the propaganda they had believed. That shock, that moment of realization, stayed with them for the rest of their lives.